Okay. Um, so it looks like we don't have any super important changes this week. Um, so I guess for better or worse, maybe for better. Hey Liz. Um, so I like just dropped this into the agenda as opposed to giving people time to read it beforehand. Um, hey Rob. Um, but I wanted to share the kind of summary from the interviews with everybody and kind of, to just share a compilation of like thoughts people had around their interests, ideas for other forms of dissemination, some structural ideas. And so we could, since we don't have important changes to discuss, um, maybe we could take a minute to peruse um, this document, or I could just kind of verbally share some highlights. Do people have a preference for reading versus me um, kind of verbally sharing?
Why don't you start off by giving us your summary? It'd be great.
Okay. Um, so uh, overall, I thought it was super interesting because I talked to all 12 people who are currently um, uh, analysts. I didn't actually talk to all the dev folks, but I thought about it. And if folks want to, I would love to, because I think it'd be great to get that, that piece of it as well. But of the folks who are currently analysts, there are 12 people. And interestingly, it kind of broke down pretty evenly what people's interests are. About half of the folks said that they are interested in doing the weekly monitoring and really like having a completable task to do every week, to feel like you are, contributing to something, that, and just to be able to have that as like check off the to-do list. Other folks have said that the kind of kind of the weekly deadline is too much for them and doesn't fit with their schedule, and they'd much prefer having a more ad hoc ability to contribute in more of an ad hoc fashion, or have more of like a project format where they're in charge of certain deliverables, but have kind of a longer time frame where they can kind of figure out their schedule and how they want to accomplish those tasks. Um, and some people have said they, prefer kind of zooming out and thinking about things like kind of broad scope. Um, Other folks said that they had an interest in zooming in, to do, greater contextualization of the findings. And other folks have said they really want to do the legwork that is like kind of foundational to this, so that we have any data to discuss at all, and don't necessarily, and like want to be able to hand it off to someone else to do, whatever else they're going to do with it. So I thought that was great that we had all of those interests. And about half of the folks also had interest in, things that we haven't done yet, other forms of dissemination. A lot of people said they wanted, more of a rapid response kind of thing, where, if there's a particularly notable change, or, something happens in the news and wanting to be able to respond quickly, maybe through a blog post, um, or to do a whole different kind of dissemination, like a visualization. Um, and, other folks have talked about like other ways of engaging the public, either in kind of, a one-off engagement, like a data rescue kind of event, or in, thinking about what, helping us prioritize domains to watch, or helping us, think of terms for a term analysis, other ways of engaging the public. So yeah, a lot of diverse interest there. and it kind of nicely split into chunks. Although a lot of people noted that while they're interested in all these things, everybody is busy and has time constraints, and so um, we'll, it'll take further discussion to see like who really wants to commit certain time to what. Um, but the outputs that people seemed really excited about are one, continuing reports. That's been kind of the backbone and the method that the method we've used to disseminate information to the public, and that really seeing as that is like central to Edgy's mission. um, Making sure that we are putting energy behind, that we're all collectively putting energy behind that, um, is really part and parcel of, putting energy into our mission. And so people are interested in contributing in some way to reports. The specific research outputs people have said they're interested in are both, as I just said, like the zoom out and the zoom in, of the term analysis and the contextualization. Blog posts and visualizations are the specific. Oh, and building new tools as another form of like another output. Having open source, like what Eric's been doing with the term analysis, having those as like open source scripts people can essentially pick up and use for their own projects, as another kind of like key output of the team. Um, and so for the structure of this, or any thoughts thus far? Does this sound in keeping with what people have been feeling or observing, or their own thoughts? Okay, cool. Um, for the structure of this, in order to weigh both the kind of like, I think we've already modified our structure a bit so that we, having the research team and the report team. And I think that if we make some tweaks, um, we could kind of meet those needs and be more flexible. So one thing I was thinking is if we took our whole team meeting and moved that bi-weekly, so that, and then on opposite weeks, people could have, a team meeting, to make, and so like each team is only meeting every other week, and then we have a whole, an all team meeting every other week where each team is allotted like 15 minutes to kind of, you know, give, give updates and then have like, group discussion. So we could, the analyst team could choose what handful of important changes to highlight and discuss. And then we as a group figure out what are we going to, what do we want to do next with those changes, and to kind of like make sure as a group we decide this is the pipeline. And so it's, it's kind of visible, those next steps. And that, the report writing team would present, here's our progress, here are any hiccups, and, the group could figure out, the whole group could figure out, next steps or reprioritizations or ways to support the report writing group. And same with the research group. And then same with either pairs or, the team that that's working on other forms of activities or engagements. And yeah, and then that in each, the analyst team, which would be smaller, be people who are who express interest in the monitoring, could continue to have kind of, either, whatever schedule they want, but, presumably keeping with like a weekly monitoring and a weekly uh, like a you could sorry it's 1 o'clock in the morning here. um, uh, that they could keep on this kind of like weekly to-do list, weekly, structured task, and have it on a set schedule. But the other teams might be able to kind of think of like, okay, we've got a public comment we want to write that's due in 3 months. Like, what's our structure for that? What kind of timeline do we want to work with? And just kind of have it a little bit more flexible in that way. And the big questions, of course, are, what are we going to do to ensure coordination? How do we maintain a highly collaborative and horizontal structure? Not even maintain. How do we make it more horizontal, more and more collaborative, and interactive? Um, and yeah, kind of like ensure that we still have a team feeling, even if we have like smaller teams that we're meeting with. And I mean, maybe that might enhance it, but if we do kind of have smaller teams that are meeting once a week, and then the big group meets every other week, just what kind of social dynamic does that bring? Anyway, those are some thoughts. What do you guys think?
Thanks for giving this a bunch of thought, Gretchen. This is just off the top of my head. Just sort of thinking about I guess, sort of the iterative process of the interactions, and what's the source, is one group the source group for what, I mean, to date, it has been the results of the analyst work that has then fed into the report team and the research team as well. So it's sort of just thinking about how that dynamic works. Just putting that out there. Sort of the flow of source information to output, right?
I'm kind of wondering about fragmenting collaborative energy. You were mentioning, like, how do we make sure that there's a collaborative team environment if we have smaller sub-teams? And I also wonder how we make sure that web monitoring is collaborating well with other groups within EDGI, because that's something that we've talked about as a priority before as well. And I personally have no interest in going through again the same thing that was happening in like January, February, where the rest of the working groups were saying that they had no idea what web monitoring was doing, and they felt like it was hard to follow. And I think that that's also something to think about. If there are a lot of subgroups and a lot of things going on, like, how do you make sure that people actually do know what's going on?
Those are both good points.
I guess this is, I'm just going to put it out there because it's kind of this, maybe it's being in Pete's instead of my home office, but it's just sort of something that maybe would have come up had we had the larger EDGI gathering this year, but just sort of thinking of, sort of writ large for the future, what web monitoring will mean as politics changes. There are changes in hopefully administrations, and where our work will be most valuable.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm writing notes. If I look like I'm not paying attention, I'm writing notes. Yeah, I think those are all really good points. And think I think that part of the I know other groups are interested in finding ways to collaborate with web monitoring, which and mostly it seems like it's um, you know kind of contacting through the research group or the or I guess maybe and also the interests of the research group are kind of in that contextualization wanting to get in touch with the EDJ or academic writing, um, but but that but I think it's a good point that that is then a fraction of what's happening in web monitoring, and so that information isn't flowing, and we if we don't know the if I think that's already starting to happen, Liz, that fragmenting is now that I think about it, um, and while I think that um, that it's important for the to think about the or really to the future of web monitoring. I think in large way it could be these like broader collaborations across EDGI, though we don't know because you're right, we haven't really met all together, um, but that flow of information within web monitoring, we do need to get that kind of like also incorporated into the broader EDGI. I think those are kind of all three of those are related issues. Um, does anyone have experience with other groups where they've done like, kind of like subcommittees and then bringing back to the whole and how that's worked well?
I have, and it just depends on, I think, the sense of shared purpose. So I've done it mostly within conferences or sort of nonprofit kind of things, where so for the conference it was like, okay, here's the scholarship subcommittee, here's the sponsor subcommittee, things like that. And so I think everyone knows that they're all working towards the same thing, just a different aspect of it. um, and so it works, I think as long as everybody knows, and obviously everybody comes through with what they're doing, but having that sort of shared purpose and shared understanding is the most important thing.
Yeah, I agree with Justin. I think I've experienced this before in like organizing conferences and also in a youth nonprofit that I managed for a bit. And we had a whole bunch of conversations about structure and how you make sure that the teams talk to each other and things like that. But I think it's sort of a unique challenge with EDGI because most people don't see each other in person ever, or very infrequently. So, I mean, I think for me in my past experiences, a big part of it has been trusting that everyone else around you is working towards the same thing, which already takes a lot to establish, and not needing to know 100% of what everyone else is doing to be able to jump in with something helpful. I think, yeah, there's maybe still some thinking to be done about how to do that virtually. Not that it's, not doable. It's just, a different challenge.
I realize that this is means more resources, and it also may not be necessary, absolutely necessary, in the EDGI organization. But in larger organizations that I've been involved with, there were people who were sort of designated as linking pins, sort of linking pin liaisons, who were folks who could bring back what was going on in the other groups. And also the trust was there. That person would represent the base group as well in the other direction. So, and that's something that potentially could work, especially if people are also interested in learning about what other folks are doing, thinking outside of web monitoring particularly.
I was going to say the exact same thing, except that, you know, it doesn't even necessarily need to be a formally identified person. I mean, you know, somebody, you know, we have the all edgy meetings, and I haven't been attending them as frequently as I would have liked to, but they are open to everyone, and they are a chance for people to report on what their own part or segment of edgy is working on. And I haven't been to these meetings as frequently as I would have liked to, especially recently, but you know, I think hearing somebody report back from the all edgy meeting about what other groups are doing could be an important component of the agenda every week or every other week. And that doesn't have to be Gretchen. It can be whoever's able to make it. I would certainly benefit from that, because if I'm not able to make it to the all edgy meeting, maybe I'll be able to make it to this meeting, and I can still get looped into everything else. So that's one kind of actual, potentially practical link of keeping us all together.
Yeah, just to underscore, I mean, you know, it shouldn't all fall on Gretchen to be that linking pin for everything, right? But you can help sort of figure out where you want to be and have the most contribution to make.
Mm-hmm. And so y'all don't get too sick of my voice. I think that's a good idea. Maybe we could also put, like, if we do, I mean, well, I guess we already do different team meetings, like the research meeting, the report writing meeting. And we could do like a blogs group, or, you know, something like that. Maybe also putting a standing item on the agenda in those meetings of like, how does this work relate to the whole? And just kind of like making sure that we're, they were always thinking back to, like, you know, as a unit, what are our goals? And like, I think that could be helpful, to even in between weeks, making sure we're kind of like still framing that. Okay, so more work is needed to flesh this out. I'll put I'll put some feelers out on Slack as well, but does moving the weekly meeting to a bi-weekly sound like a good idea or a bad idea? I see a lot of pros and cons of both.
So I'd be worried that we'd start getting back into like the 2-hour meeting territory, because we'd have a lot to catch up on. So I think it would just necessitate being really strict about updates, and that creates its own level of infrastructure. And then we get back into what we have seen in other things in Edgy. It's like, okay, here's your 10-minute update for this kind of thing. And then because of the distributed nature, it doesn't, people start to feel left out, et cetera. So I would worry that we would lose some of the connections. I think as sort of Liz brought up earlier, and some of the things that we've already experienced previously as a group.
That's a super good point. Is there a way to make these meetings more like working meetings as opposed to like all report back format? I generally find myself like more engaged or more interested when I'm like actively working on a task together in a meeting. But I don't know.
I think a lot of I think when we're going through the changes, I think, and we're looking at, and I think especially when we're talking about some of the dev stuff, or sort of like how could we, like the things last week with some of the sage grouse changes and figuring out how to make the things display more properly, realistically, whatever. I mean, that feels more like sort of working, because we're sort of trying to address different problems and things like that. But a lot of the work that we do doesn't fit within a 1 hour time frame. Like we're sort of waiting on different groups, or or research or things like that. So, or is it sort of, I could see it if they're like testing or prototyping something, or like running through some of the term searches and things like that. So I think again, it just have to be sort of scoped and defined as, and having sort of set tasks that aren't like collaborative writing, because that's the thing that we could do a lot of, but I worry that would get out of hand.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's a lot of work in the research team that could be productively brought back into the web monitoring team as a whole, for something that approaches a kind of work together scenario, or something where there's a bit more hands-on involvement of like, is this a good way to visualize this? What term should we be looking for, etc. And I don't have anything more specific than that, but it does seem to me that the bigger question here is like, how do we be flexible, as events on the ground change, right? As like we end up with a week like this where there aren't many important changes or none, and how do we expand and contract, and I don't know, that just seems like an important part of this conversation.
I guess I kind of feel like the report back is still super valuable, though, especially as there are sort of maybe more subgroups doing more different things. Having a place where people can update each other on what's going on and what they've discovered and get feedback on that is like a hugely important component of building that sense of like shared goal and responsibility and understanding. And so I don't know, I feel like we should be careful not to lose that.
And I would just echo as well that I do also think that a weekly meeting is important. I can't necessarily make it every week, unfortunately. But although that was in part because Mondays were bad for me, but shared purpose definitely facilitated by meeting every week. The question is, how do we meet every week, but then limit ourselves to an hour, but also fill out that hour, and how that changes every week.
One thing that worked quite well when I was managing a team of volunteers working on similar but not the same things, is that we had sort of more frequent one-on-one or small group meetings to talk with the people who are working in sort of the same sub-team. And then our less frequent, I guess in our case, the weekly meetings, people would suggest a thing from their subgroups area that was challenging at the moment. And so that could be the thing that took the most time in the meeting. So it could be that we don't always focus on changes for most of the time, or we don't always run down like A to Z, the list of things that are standing on the agenda. So it could be that different subgroups get priority and we spend time as a group talking about their work in different meetings.
I think that has a lot of merit. We have something, Gretchen and I have something that fits that, I think, for working on a report of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And it would be, I'm not going to take people's time with it right now, but it's a good example of something we'd want to have the group weigh in and give some perspective about what makes sense going forward. So, yeah, I like that idea, Liz.
Yeah, me too. And it could rotate, or maybe we can have it could either rotate or we could have kind of like a call out in Slack of like, hey, our team has something we want to discuss this week. And
yeah, what's the urgency factor?
Yeah. Yeah.
You must make a Google Sheets dropdown to indicate the urgency.
Okay, well, I'll incorporate all these, type them up, and share them on Slack, and um, we can continue to weigh in on next steps. But I think it's pretty clear a continued weekly meeting with everybody, and figuring out structures for the other groups and how we all coordinate, and make sure the information is flowing freely within and among other groups. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Also, along with this thought, are looking at the domains, and I know a few people have indicated in their meeting or in our interview of like certain domains that they think we should let go of, and other folks that are wanting to not do the weekly monitoring, and so we'll do some domain restructuring in the next couple of weeks. So
yeah, I would like to. I have some subdomains, right? Subdomains that I'd like to excise.
cool.
So maybe we all should take a look at our current domains with that in mind.
Yeah, that would be super helpful. If like I have notes from people who from when people brought them up in the meetings, but I think just I can make a document just of like where people could put domains of like, I think that like, see you, Justin, good night. That not that they necessarily want to keep, but like that should be kept, and that should be that they don't think need to be kept. I'll do that to facilitate this domain reallocation. Cool. And I want to actually change this up because Rob always waits to the very end of the meeting to give an update. And I'd rather put you next.
Okay. Sorry, I should have put notes in the sheet before the meeting started instead of just now. Just wanted to give a brief update on the Wayback importing stuff. I'm hoping to try and get that into production tonight. I'm running the last test to make sure it's sort of working well. Just FYI on kind of the numbers we're seeing right now, and this is based on our staging database, which is slightly smaller but fairly similar to the actual production database. When we pull out from way back just the pages that we're already tracking, what we wind up getting is about 15,000 captures that we try and download every day, which is actually 35 to 45,000 for a 3-day period, because basically we run overlapping downloads every day to make sure, like, if we missed some the day before or something else weird happened, we have a better chance at like sucking those up on the next subsequent run. But so we get like about 15,000 captures from way back a day. That doesn't necessarily mean new versions of pages, but like records of snapshots that way back made. And then we figure out whether those correspond to new versions or not. But unfortunately, like, there was that whole issue about a lot of captures in Wayback can't actually be played back, or downloaded externally. And so at scale from the staging database, that turns out to be roughly 20 to 35% of all captures cannot be played back. So unfortunately, we just kind of lose those, but like, important to understand at what scale we have like some loss there because of the way Internet Archive works. And then we have like a 1 to 5% error rate in all those downloads of the 15,000 captures. So, 150 of them per day roughly like fail to download for some reason. And I'm working on like various strategies to try and make that more robust, doing multiple passes and working on how much we keep retrying and backing off and stuff like that. But sometimes those errors are just like also other spurious errors that we can't avoid, that like the page doesn't necessarily fail to play back, but like Wayback just explodes when you ask for it for some reason. But just like as a general sense of like, so you all know what's working and not working and at what scale we're getting data from them and what'll start happening tonight, hopefully. So maybe next week, I'll make one of the spreadsheets that Gretchen gets in her inbox be one that's scoped to just data that came from Internet Archive.
Thank you, Rob.
That's amazing. That is a huge deliverable. Liz?
Yeah, is the 28 to 30% that fail to play back, is that static? Like, those are versions that are always going to fail, or is it just randomly 28% is not going to happen, but maybe the next time other ones will be, back?
It's reasonably static. So the real story on that is Internet Archive will store stuff, but under varying complicated conditions, it may or may not be able to serve it back. And most of those conditions are pretty static, where it's basically like, we stored this in such a way and captured things at such a rate or whatever that we just decided that it's really costly for us to play back this capture. So frequently it happens if there's a lot of captures of a page, it makes some of them non-playbackable, so they kind of go into cold storage, or they're otherwise complicated to retrieve because of the way they index and like manage the metadata around the data. So you know that it's there, but you can't get it. And mostly that's reasonably static. It's stuff that they're sort of working on trying to make better so that more things are playbackable. And most of the errors that are playback errors are very, very, very rarely something that's going to be different tomorrow. Like, it wasn't playbackable today, but it will be tomorrow, or vice versa. Usually, if that's the case, it'll actually be in that bucket of the 1 to 5%, like just errors.
I'm sorry if I missed this, but is there any relationship to the likelihood of a new version of that same page being playbackable?
Not really. So like, one of the common situations is basically if there are, so Wayback has many different crawlers that are set up in a variety of different ways that are constantly running. And part of this depends on the behavior of any particular crawler. So it depends partially on how a page got added to Wayback. And some crawlers do a better job of trying to sort of deduplicate what's getting stored. So if they ask for a page today that they also asked for yesterday and get the same response back, they store it as something called a revisit, which basically means under the hood, Wayback has only stored one copy of it, and the one from today is actually just a pointer to the one from yesterday. And if a page is captured frequently and a certain number of those are revisits, then the revisits will not be playbackable, because they made sort of a judgment call that, like, in that case, probably we can just redirect you to the closest in time capture, and that will be good enough because there are revisits involved, and that's fine. But that doesn't turn out, from our perspective at least, the way we look at pages and the frequency with which we care about, doesn't turn out to be the same calculation for them as it is for us. So that particular situation is the one Marcy was originally running into that put me onto the track of the whole thing, where the closest in time that it found when it couldn't play back that revisit was not only like 2 months away, as opposed to days or hours away, but it was in the future rather than the previous capture that would have been the same. So because what it's really doing is looking for the closest in time, not the most recent in time, which also seems weird to my brain, but that is the way they have it set up over there. So a lot of the complicated bits in the importing pertain to when we ask for a snapshot, making sure that we got what we asked for, or something that was near enough in time to what we asked for to be okay, which is way more complicated than it should be. Does that answer the question? I hope.
I hope Otis Redding isn't interfering too much here. He never interferes. I'm assuming, I mean, we were able to see that though, right? So we should continue to be able to see that, right?
Yes.
So it's not like that happens, but then we also can't note that future or prior date.
Yes.
So, yeah, okay.
Yeah, you can always see that. You just have to be, if you're using Wayback, you can always see that. You just have to be paying attention to realize that, like, oh, I asked for November 12th, and the date on the screen that it returned to me at the end of the click is November 20th. You just have to be paying enough attention to know that where you landed wasn't the thing that you actually clicked on, which, I don't know, to me, that's a subtle thing that I realized after you pointed it out that I have often not noticed. And it's, you know, computationally on the importing side, we just throw it away if it doesn't match, basically. So.
Thank you, Rob. That is huge and is so complicated. I thought it was complicated enough before this quirk was discovered.
Well, it's just, I just spent such an amazing amount of time realizing and dealing with a variety of ways in which, because the way the system works is you can search for like a set of criteria and get back a list of all the captures for that criteria for over a period of time. And you would think based on that, you could just ask for each of the things on the list and get them. And in the realization that when you ask for any of the things on the list, you might get something totally different, or you might not be able to get it at all. Like the thing on the list might just not even be there. Like that was the most absurd part. And yes, so that's all solved now. So hopefully also the tools for this will be exposed in a way that's useful for doing the research work also. So if you need to pull things out of Internet Archive, you can just use this tool and it'll yell at you if it turns out that the thing you asked for isn't actually there, or like if it's returning to you something different from what you asked for, it makes all that clear and does all the right checks for you. So you don't have to go through the pain that I did over the past week.
Thank you. Hi, Kevin.
Hey, everyone.
Hey, I'm sorry, I have to get going. So thank you all, and look forward to, we're gonna have a meeting next week, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right, thanks so much.
Same time. Thanks, Brian. Okay, Kevin, we're jumping around in the agenda, but we're actually to the last part of the agenda are the web monitoring team updates. Let's see, Eric, you want to give update on your most recent research stuff?
Yeah, so really where we're at right now is we're in two different places, I think. I don't mean that in a bad way, but it's just we've got two different kind of things going on, which really aren't that different. Anyway, we are figuring out and testing and experimenting with ways to visualize the data we already have, right? So you all have seen this before, right? But we have done, term counts for 20, 30 odd some terms, comparing early 2016 with early 2018. So we have that information. We've got a bunch of counts for terms like climate change, resilience, energy independence, and we're able to see the differences on specific pages in the use of those terms. And now we are figuring out how to analyze that in a way that's most communicative and effective, and also do some exploratory kind of analysis with it to generate hypotheses and explore maybe pages we didn't pick up on in the web monitoring work here. There's some really, I think, interesting visualizations in the research channel. So I encourage you to hop on over there. Just different ways of showing that, for instance, the use of climate change has substantially decreased over the past a couple of years, and that in some cases it switched to resilience on specific pages, and how that breaks down by agency. So that's the first kind of area or space we're in right now. And the second is, okay, so that's experimenting with how we work with the data we already have. The problem is there's some issues with that, with those counts. Specifically, they include a lot of counts from headers and footers on a page, which we don't necessarily want to include because they're repeated across a site, a domain, right? So, in 2016, climate was pretty much in every EPA page simply because it was in a header. There are ways around that. We have ways around that, but we need to go back and do all the counts again. So really what needs to happen right now is to finalize the set of terms we want to look at. People have been adding different terms. We've got a list of like almost 50 now. We just need to set that and move forward and then redo the count again and get a more accurate count, a more useful count. And ultimately, I think this is going to provide us with we've, in the web monitoring team, we've done the excellent work of like highlighting not only individual cases, but subdomain-wide cases where terms have changed, pages have been removed, access been reduced, so on. This kind of analysis can I think, give us a bit more context as well, to show us what the picture looks like across the federal government, how that breaks down by agencies, and more specific to terms, and just essentially how that's changed over 2 years as opposed to last week or whatever. So that is where we're at, I think, with the research team. But Gretchen, Marcy, and others should feel free to join in.
No, that's great. Thanks, Eric. And Marcy, you want to give an update on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act report?
So it's asymptotically getting there. Gretchen did a great, both actually technical and content review. And one of the things we're just dealing with right now is how much context we include in the report, given that there's been so much activity subsequent to the changes and related to the DOI solicitor's memorandum. And, there's a letter from 10 senators to Zinke. There's a letter from 62 congressfolk. There's 17 former DOI officials who wrote to Zinke, and then 8 attorneys general filed suit against the DOI, led by the New York Attorney General. And so one of the things we're sort of doing a push-pull about is sort of how much of that to actually include in the report versus put in some other framing kind of way. So we're playing right now with trying to include some of that baseline inside the report, because it's important contextual information that we can report on objectively too. Right? So it's exciting. I mean, it's crazy making, but it's exciting. Thank you, Gretchen.
Yeah, and I think that should be, I see we've got 3 minutes to go, but another week, I think it is important to have a whole group discussion about, a lot of people have talked about wanting to bring in some more context to the reports, but how we do that and, how we frame it and make sure that, we're not, that we're still credible as an objective source, but also providing this useful context that will help people understand the significance of this is important. But I'm really excited for this report. It's a great one.
Just a shout out to Erin, who's not here, who did the baseline work and is still around to help. So.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, that's all of the agenda that I see. Anything else in the last 2 minutes? Awesome, thanks all. I will clean up the notes and write some action items, and the stuff about the discussion of team structure, and make sure that gets on Slack so more people can contribute to it. And thank you for that useful discussion. I think it was really helpful. All right. Good night.
Yeah, sweet dreams. Great.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks.